Hello, everyone. I'm here this week talking with you about California during the Cold War era. And really, this is the early Cold War era, really everything from 1945, the end of World War II, all the way up to the very beginning of the 1960s, really where we see the most dramatic and profound changes in California. This is a time of incredible importance in California history. And I think you'll see that here and in our next week's work when we talk about the 1960s and early 1970s. A lot of what we know of as California today is forged during this time period, in particular, California's population. Many of us watching this video or sitting making this video have our own sort of ancestors, are the people who came to California in our families in the past. These are people that came actually during this time period, starting with the tail end of World War II in the beginning and throughout the 1960s. This is a time of incredible population change in California. In 1945 alone, almost 300,000 former service people took their discharges and settled here. I mean, this is, obviously a profound change building on the changes that we talked about in our last work with World War II. So my goal here this week is to talk to you about California during this time period, but also to provide you with some context in American history. I know some of you have probably pretty recently taken American history, but for many of us, we have not taken an American history course in a while, perhaps even not since high school, and particularly modern American history. So I'm going to start by just giving a little bit of quick context to understand what this whole Cold War thing is all about. And then we will go into and talk a bit more about California during this time period, because it's a really remarkable era in our history. And there's a lot of really important specific things, but here, this is like when we go back to the very beginning of the course when I gave you that Wallace Stegner quote, California is like the rest of the United States, only more so. Here's where it really comes to bear, because we're going to see how California really is not only sort of following national trends, but perhaps more importantly, is leading them and is on a much larger scale, sort of driving the trends that we see in America throughout this period, the 1940s and 1950s. To begin with, I want to talk about this idea of the Cold War in three areas: in politics, in economics, and in culture and social life. And start by talking about politics. The Cold War era, which really begins in 1945 with the detonation of the atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. This is a period in which America has come to real political and military dominance across the globe. We are the victorious power of World War II, but we are also countered by this other major power, the Soviet Union. During the time period between 1945 and 1989, the United States will never go to war with the Soviet Union, but we will fight a series of proxy wars, really fighting over the control of the globe through our allies and through our connections. A lot of historians describe this period as a period in which the world became bipolar, following two poles: one, free market capitalism, and the other, totalitarian socialism, right? The idea of the United States being a democratic power that followed free market capitalism, and the Soviet Union a totalitarian state, sort of working towards a communist system through socialism. So we think about it in this way, we start to understand America's foreign policy aims were very much to maintain control over as much of the world as possible, to have as much of the world as possible follow our system, and to stop the spread of totalitarian socialism. We call this idea containment. Okay, in our foreign policy, containment meant stopping the spread of totalitarian socialism from state to state to state. There was a theory called domino theory that one after the other, nations would fall to this system, really succumbing to military, cultural, and political duress. And then all of a sudden, the entire globe would be essentially embroiled in socialist or Marxist revolutions. The United States would be outgunned and outnumbered. We would fall to that as well. So we had to stop the spread of these systems, and this is what this idea of containment means in terms of foreign policy. This is outlined in a document produced in 1947 by the National Security Council called NSC 68, and it sort of explains domino theory and goes into detail about how the United States needs to stop the spread. This is the foundation of our entire foreign policy, or essentially much of our foreign policy throughout the Cold War period. And indeed, although we're only focusing on the 40s and 50s here when things are really ramping up, the Cold War does last for several decades with a bit of an intermission we call détente during the 1970s. Americans were very concerned about the spread of totalitarian socialism, about communists laying in our midst. Now, I want to be clear here because I know that you will see this, and you certainly have probably heard this before, that the term communist is used interchangeably with totalitarian socialist. To be clear, the Soviet Union was not a truly communist state, although that was its goal. Communism is not something that it never achieved. So people, when they label the Soviet Union as a communist place, that's an ideal, something they want to work towards, but in reality, they're a totalitarian socialist system. They actually have, in some ways, more in common even with some of our allies than they would with a truly and purely communist system that was sort of theorized both by Marx and then later, of course, by Lenin under Leninism and by Stalin under Stalinism. So if we think about the Cold War as a war of containment, we can also understand the culture of this period as a culture of containment, that in the United States, not just abroad, but at home, we had to maintain our way of life in as stark of a contrast, as different as possible than the Soviet Union. So if the Soviet Union shuns religion, we need to embrace it. And that's actually a good example of this idea of domestic containment, an idea that's developed by historian Elaine Tyler May, right? During the 50s, the United States really pushes people to embrace, in particular, evangelical Protestant Christianity as a way to demonstrate our difference from the Soviet Union. It's actually in the 1950s that we add the phrase "under God" to our Pledge of Allegiance, okay, even to our coined money, right? So we're different than them. The Soviet Union allows men and women to work side by side in factories and doesn't have as clear definition of gender roles. Well, we're going to have very rigid gender roles where women do not have access to the same jobs as men. Do you see this idea of containment is to do everything the opposite of what we think the Soviet Union is doing? I want to show you a short video that I think illustrates what we historians call this sort of age of American anxiety, where Americans were trying to do everything they could to stop the spread of communism and maintain control over this kind of culture. And at the beginning here, you're going to learn some tips about how to spot a communist. So go ahead and watch this, and we'll talk a little bit about it in just a moment.
Therefore, propaganda is vastly more important in democratic societies.
In recognizing a communist, physical appearance counts for nothing. If he openly declares himself to be a communist, we take his word for it. If a person consistently reads and advocates the views expressed in a communist publication, he may be a communist. If a person supports organizations which reflect communist teachings, or organizations labeled communist by the Department of Justice, she may be a communist. If a person defends the activities of communist nations while consistently attacking the domestic and foreign policy of the United States, she may be a communist. If a person does all these things over a period of time, he must be a communist. But there are other communists who don't show their real faces, who work more silently.
Now, as you watch this next part of the video, here I'll come back, sorry about that. As you watch the next part of this video, I want you to look at the names of some of these organizations. At the beginning of the 1950s, end of the 40s, beginning of the 50s, the membership in the Communist Party of the United States was very, very small. There were very few people who were members of this, but the anxiety about these people was at an all-time high. Now, I want you to look at some of these organizations because some of them are going to be like, oh, yeah, I can see why these people might be suspected of being communists. But keep looking, and you'll notice that some of these organizations are just organizations that are actually on the left. They have nothing to do with communism, but they do have something to do with advocating for equal rights, civil rights, that kind of thing. And that actually, those fights become connected to the fight against communism, that these people who are advocating these things are actually advocating things against the US government. So let's look at these groups.
By the early 1950s, Communist Party membership had declined considerably, but Cold War propaganda inflated its threat to fantastic proportions. An evil so pervasive that the whole society had to be mobilized to combat it.
May Day brings a wave of anti-communist sentiment as 100,000 march down New York's Fifth Avenue in a loyalty parade. Everyone from vets to youngsters reveals his inborn dislike of communism. A united answer to those menacing our country's liberty.
Okay, so now what we're going to watch, okay, is a clip from a film called Red Nightmare, and this was made in the midst of the 1950s. I want you to think about this. Let's close read what we see here. This is actually made in Hollywood. I want you to see what is going on here, and let's try to close read. What is being undermined here? This is a fantasy. What if the Soviet Union took over the United States? What would a communist United States look like? And what would be subverted? So let's look at what's being the order, the authority that's being subverted in this clip.
Sergeant, check the kitchen. You look in the back. I'll be upstairs.
What is this? Where do you think you're going?
We have no time for explanations. Already we are 15 minutes behind schedule.
You haven't sent your why. You're not going to take another step until I see a warrant.
Warrant? We need no warrant. As a member of the Young Communist League, your daughter has volunteered for farm work. She's to be transported immediately. The truck is waiting outside.
You say my daughter volunteered?
That is correct. Here's her signature. Requesting transport to the People's Collective.
Signature on that piece of paper is false. And everything you've said is a lie because my daughter would never leave here of her own free will.
Sergeant!
You've got no right to be in this house. I'm going to give you just 10 seconds to get out of here.
Daddy? It's true, Daddy. I did volunteer for farm work.
Then why?
The party convinced me that I should free myself of the lingering bourgeois influence of family life. I am ready. Do not interfere. It is for my own good.
And Comrade Donovan, do not think that your deviationist remarks shall be overlooked. It will be reported to the proper authorities.
Okay, so I think it's kind of a sort of an amazing clip. If you think about it, what's being subverted here? For one, that's going to be an awkward Thanksgiving when she comes back. Okay, two, she's fascinating, right? She's like doesn't use contractions. She's like a robot. She's been clearly brainwashed by the communists. But what's being subverted here is in the American household is the power of the father. And I want you to think about this. Communism is challenging patriarchal systems in the minds of Americans, so thus we need to sort of empower patriarchy. All of this stuff is important to understand that the United States, following World War II, we're not going to go in 1945 right into another war, but we're going to continue spending and indeed increase spending on our military in order to fight this war against the Soviets, a war that we are afraid is going to break out at any second. This is what we see leading to the creation of what our president during much of the 1950s, Dwight D. Eisenhower, calls the military-industrial complex. Billions and billions and billions of dollars spent on government grants and contracts with private industry in order to help to develop America's capacity to fight a war against the Soviet Union. Not if it happens, but when. And this is not just a war to fight, for over territory, over resources, but over the hearts and minds of people, over a way of life. This is how serious it is. It is really providing the foundation for the development of the American military apparatus that exists today. The American military that we see in the 21st century is largely constructed and based on a foundation of growing funding during the Cold War period, right? We don't see a contraction of spending, we actually see a growth in spending. It's going to be very difficult to cut that back once you get started. So we can see, right, these are all going to be important things, and I'm laying some groundwork here to understand why California is so important in this, because just like in World War II, in the post-war period, a disproportionate amount of resources will be spent in California to fight the Cold War, especially in developing this military-industrial complex. Let's move to economics and talk about the sort of economic realities of this period. Although there is a very brief recession immediately following World War II, economic growth really takes off starting by the end of 1946 and the beginning of 1947. A lot of this has to do with a growth in the American savings rate. People had saved a lot of money during the war. There weren't a lot of consumer goods. It was also driven by government intervention in the economy. The United States had a very high tax rate, okay, which allowed government not only to spend money on the military-industrial complex, but also in areas that helped to sort of enable social mobility. A great example of this is a piece of legislation passed during World War II in 1944 called the GI Bill of Rights. The GI Bill of Rights allowed for federal financing and support of people who serve, veterans, to go back to college or go into college to begin with. Now, before World War II, college was something that very few people went to, it was really limited. But after the Second World War, because of the GI Bill, many hundreds of thousands of working class Americans will go to college, will take advantage of the GI Bill, and will have access to social mobility, right? Education is the primary key of social mobility. And here we go, right? The government's spending money on this. The government also in 1946 will pass an Employment Act that says it's the job of the federal government to ensure or work towards full employment. This is what helps to create the Council of Economic Advisors. This is all important apparatus that exists even today in the 21st century. So what we start to see by the end of the 1940s is economic expansion that is unprecedented. It will last until 1973. We won't have a recession during this time period. The growth will slow, will ebb and flow a bit, right? But for the most part, fairly consistent. And a lot of this growth is centered on what we call the Sun Belt states, from California stretching to Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada. These states will grow at a much faster, much more dramatic rate. And most notably, two of those states, Texas and more importantly, California, will grow at an even faster rate. And a lot of this has to do with growth in federal spending in California, growth in population in California, all of this money getting consolidated, particularly in the Golden State. It makes a lot of sense that the second gold rush of World War II would only continue during the Cold War period. It's during this period, too, that we see a growth in consumer culture. Part of what defined us in terms of containment was that the United States, unlike the Soviet Union, had access to lots of consumer goods. So we started to define our Americanness by buying things, particularly new kinds of products, devices and appliances for our homes, for example, like dishwashers and televisions that were not common or not present before the Second World War in most American households. Where I think we see the most interesting developments are in terms of culture and social life. We had to regulate our behavior, our way of being, to distinguish ourselves from the Soviets. So anything that was seen as aberrant or different or transgressive needed to be stifled. In my American history courses, what I often do is I spend time talking about this through the lens of health films. Federal, state, and local governments spent millions of dollars throughout the late 1940s all the way through the 60s and early 70s to fund the production of films in Hollywood that can be shown to young people in health courses to help them engage in what one film calls right behavior. These films emphasize strategies that sort of highlight Americanness, that we are different than the Soviets. The Soviets have a permissive sexual culture, so we will have a repressive sexual culture, right? Indeed, sex ed changes dramatically across the United States. Instead of happening predominantly in, say, biology classrooms, sex ed moves into these new health and home economics courses where the word sex is not even mentioned. I actually love these health films. If you're interested in them, you should definitely check some of them out. My favorite is a film, and you can find this easily on YouTube, called How Much Affection. I would show it here. We don't have a whole lot of time, but How Much Affection tells you what you should and should not do on a date, and it's pretty fantastic. It's interesting, as we move to this abstinence-only policy of sex ed throughout the United States, the reaction is amazing. Teenage birth rates increase dramatically, right? Premarital sex has been happening for a long time, and it only grows when there is this kind of like forbidden nature, this allure. Whenever you tell a teenager they can't do something, they're going to want to do it, right? This is something I think all of us know pretty well. But of course, without having access to adequate sex ed and understanding perhaps how to use or having access to contraception, which was still fairly controversial in America during this period, right, teenage pregnancy rates will soar, and that will continue on through into the 1960s, and then attitudes will start to change a little bit about that. We also see, tied to this sort of growing birth rate amongst young people, a growing birth rate amongst people of marriageable age as well. We call this the so-called baby boom, which really kind of starts in 1946, following World War II, and lasts into the middle of the 1960s. Usually we give it a kind of a 20-year window and say 1966 is the close or the end of the baby boom, in which Americans are not only having children, they're having more children. And this puts a lot of stress on resources, and particularly on American cities and cities in California, which triggers the development of the suburbs. All of this should provide some context and foundation. Think about this, right? We are altering on the national stage, we're altering how we behave, how we act, the rules that we live by, and that's going to have a huge impact on really the culture that we see in America. Now think about California and what's going to happen in California, and you'll start to see, as I go through this material, a lot of resonance with this larger national story. Let's start by talking a little bit about what happens in post-war California. So many people are going to settle in California during the 1940s, first because of World War II, and later because of the post-war sort of demand for labor, partly caused by the sort of growth or maintenance of federal spending in the Golden State. Okay, we think about California's population, it grows by millions during the 1940s. That only continues. In fact, it almost doubles within a decade between 1950 and 1960. So more and more people are coming to settle, and predominantly they're coming to settle in what we call metropolitan regions, urban cores and suburban sort of rings surrounding those urban cores. The major metropolitan regions in California, the largest, of course, are San Francisco Bay Area and the Los Angeles region, Los Angeles Basin. But even smaller metropolitan areas like Sacramento and San Diego will grow considerably during this period. By 1960, 90% of the state's population lives in one of these major metropolitan areas. It is the highest percentage of population living in an urban or suburban area in the United States in 1960. So we have the most urban population in California, which is remarkable given the size and the large areas of rural settlement in California during this period. Lots of people came for opportunity, they came for climate, right? And many of them were veterans that had come after serving the war. I mentioned 300,000 in that first year were going to take discharges, and many of them, having trained and worked in California, will settle here as well. Okay, so we think about the arrival of more and more of these people. We're also going to see communities that are going to be a bit under duress as a result of the creation of this Cold War culture. As a number of historians have argued, one example of these populations, members of the LGBT community, these are people that historians have argued have actually had much more liberty and much more openness before the Second World War than after. After the Second World War, there are going to be laws and restrictions put into effect and placed particularly in American cities that will put pressure on these populations, in part because they're seen as aberrant and potentially sites of communist infiltration. Indeed, many Cold War politicians argued that being so-called quote-unquote homosexual was tantamount to being a communist. Now, there is going to be certainly resistance to this, and of course, some of the great examples of this resistance are really heralded and founded here in California. In 1950, a veteran of World War II, Harry Hay, founds the Mattachine Society. In 1955, Phyllis Lyon and Del Martin found a lesbian organization called the Daughters of Bilitis in San Francisco. These are organizations which become really connected and synonymous with the California experience. Indeed, in cities like San Francisco, large populations of lesbian, gay, transgendered folk, bisexual folks, these are all people who are living in communities and are finding safety and community with one another. This is a really great image. It's actually from a lesbian bar in San Francisco during the early 1950s. I love finding these pieces, and there's so much great scholarship about this. In fact, at San Francisco State, one of the most sort of renowned historians of gay and lesbian history in the United States, Nan Boyd, she's actually a professor at San Francisco State, so someone you should definitely seek out and take a class with. She's really fantastic. And think about these kinds of communities too, again, under increasing duress in San Francisco. We tend to think of San Francisco as having sort of a deep history of acceptance. This is actually a copy of The Ladder, which is a publication of the Daughters of Bilitis. This is from 1966. But indeed, San Francisco was a very different place in the 1950s. There was a lot of resistance to the idea of San Francisco having a queer community or an active queer community, especially because of the concerns about communism. Police in San Francisco regularly raided bars like the Black Cat Cafe, which were popular with not just LGBT folks, but also with beat poets and musicians, people on the left. Indeed, it's interesting. These raids were so commonplace that the owner of the bar will actually go all the way to the California State Supreme Court and say you can't do this, and the Supreme Court will actually side with the owner of the bar, which actually creates a legal precedent that people, gay and lesbian folks, queer folks, have the right to gather in public spaces on their own. This is one of the reasons why legislators during the 1950s will start pressing for what we call consenting adults legislation. This is legislation that would legalize sexual contact between people of the same gender. Okay, where we start to see it take a turn, though, towards this sort of Cold War trend is in the 1959's mayor's race in San Francisco. The mayor at the time was a man named George Christopher, who many had seen as being somewhat supportive, or at least tacitly supportive, of gay and lesbian people in the city. His opponent, Russ Walden, blamed Christopher for what he saw as a quote-unquote homosexual infiltration of San Francisco. He represented the feelings of a lot of straight working-class San Franciscans, and as a result, Christopher will actually come to castigate and go against the gay and lesbian communities of the city. This is a huge moment in San Francisco's political history in 1959. As Warren goes against the LGBT community, what he does is lights a fire of organization, a political organization that by the 1970s will lead to the election of the first gay man to elective office in the United States. And of course, we know who that is. That's Harvey Milk. So I want to move on and talk a little bit about some of the challenges that California faced during this period. Again, I talked a little bit about this idea of economic growth in the post-war period. We see more diversification of the economy after that little bit of a recession, that little bit of a bump. We see more focus on new kinds of industries, the development of electronics, for example, things that are connected directly to defense spending and things that are connected to consumer goods. And in particular, we see widespread growth of industry in California. More and more women will be working in industry as well in California following the Second World War. Now, before World War II, 1 in 4 women over 16 worked outside of the home. By 1960, that was 2 in 5. By 1970, it was more than half. And I want us to think about this. The demographics of these women were changing as well. They were more likely to be married, more likely to have young children, right? These numbers and the demographics of these working populations are important right? It is a much more versatile and much more mobile labor pool in California, and that's going to attract more and more industry looking for workers who are able to accept the kinds of wages that they want to pay. In particular, one of the most important industries in California obviously is going to be the defense industry. And defense and aerospace production in California is going to grow quite rapidly with the pre-existing relationships with universities like California Institute of Technology, Stanford, and the University of California at Berkeley. Billions of dollars will be spent on research and development, including scientific inquiry to further develop things like nuclear weapons and nuclear physics, as well as in computer technology. We also see the rise and development of a more advanced and sophisticated aerospace industry in Southern California. By 1960, 70% of the workers in San Diego County were industrial workers in aerospace, okay? 60% of industrial workers in Los Angeles and Orange counties were working in aerospace. This is a boom, and they're working not just for defense, but they're also working, here's one of these huge aerospace plants, right, aircraft plants. They're not just working for defense, they're also working for consumer and commercial airlines, right? We think about the expansion of air travel in the 1950s and 1960s with the jet engine revolution. Still, it's important to note that how much money is flowing in, federal dollars are flowing into California. 25%, so 1 out of every $4 spent on defense by the United States during the Cold War period was spent in California, okay? 42% of research contracts from the Defense Department spent in California, and 50% of a new organization's budget, NASA, the National Aeronautic and Space Administration, will be spent in California. Now, I want you to think about this. Even though California's industrial economy is becoming more diversified, it's also becoming very, very connected to aerospace in Southern California, which makes us vulnerable if there are ever defense cuts, particularly cuts in the aerospace industry. And that's something to sort of think about. As a result of all these people moving in and all of these jobs, we also see, of course, the expansion of housing and suburban communities, right? The population increase in California, we're going to see almost doubling in population, thing between 1940 and 1970, nearly tripling in population, 1,500 people a day coming into the state on average, right? This is going to be huge, right? We also see, of course, an expansion of the birth rate. Where are we going to put all of these people? The answer, of course, is going to be in suburban communities. This is an image I'm going to show you in just a moment. Here we go. Is an image of Irvine, California, the core of Irvine, California. Irvine is, of course, one of the great examples in urban studies of a master planned suburban community. Communities like this sprouted up all across California. These were cities that were laid out and designed all at once, and then populated with single-family detached homes, the sort of new desire and desirable communities that Americans and specifically Californians wanted to live in. These suburban tracts, okay, could be built very quickly, right? Were very decentralized, were tended to have a small town kind of feel, even though they had lots of people living in them. And this is where 2/3 of the newcomers to the state will immediately settle, okay? The houses could be built more quickly, in large part due to new technologies, specifically techniques used for prefabrication and assembly line methods to build the portions of these homes. Okay, so we have whole new communities, and the Bay Area is a great example of this. We see this if you head south from San Francisco. The hillsides of Daly City are littered with these townhomes that were built very quickly during the 1940s and 1950s. Indeed, the entire Bay Area, much of the development of the Bay Area comes about as it spreads further and further out as a result of the desire to build in more and more housing, more of these kinds of suburban communities, some of which, like Pleasant Hill in the East Bay of the San Francisco Bay Area, were laid out and designed in a very decentralized fashion, very much like the suburban communities we see sprouting up in other parts of the United States. But it wasn't just the suburbs. Developers in California were also interested in reconstructing and redeveloping big cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles. Okay, cities who had urban cores which were seen as "quote unquote" blighted, filled with poor folks, and mostly folks of color. These were seen as places that could be redeveloped to attract upper middle class and middle class white families. And this is when we start to see the development of a tendency we call urban renewal, essentially going in cities with the support of state and local governments, going in, buying up or seizing huge swaths of territory, bulldozing these older neighborhoods, again, mostly neighborhoods composed of families, poor families, and communities of color. These are neighborhoods that will be bulldozed and replaced with new housing that's attractive for these newcomers, these people who come into California, who are, again, predominantly bright, predominantly middle class and upper middle class during the 1950s. A great example of urban renewal, and San Francisco is unfortunately filled with it, is of course the neighborhoods around what today we call Japantown. This is the heart of what used to be the Fillmore, an African American neighborhood in San Francisco that will be largely bulldozed and replaced with very new kinds of housing. The people that lived in these places will be displaced and will be pushed further and further to the margins in the Bay Area. Now, the process of urban renewal will be widely discredited by the 1960s, but these projects will actually continue well into the 1990s, and even we can consider urban renewal still functioning today. South of Market, for example, was a site of urban renewal that really only took off as urban renewal was falling out of fashion. Many of the developments south of Market that are taking place today are echoes of the urban renewal projects that finished up in the 1990s, right? If you ever go to the Metreon, for example, in Yerba Buena Gardens, these are all places that used to be neighborhoods that were predominantly poor neighborhoods. These people would again be displaced out of the city. Think of this as almost gentrification by design. As you have all of these people moving in, it puts a huge amount of duress on infrastructure and public facilities. Transportation in California, in fact, really struggled, was sort of heaving under the weight of all these new people, particularly in Southern California. As a result, we see the construction of a whole new expanded network of highways and freeways to connect people who are living further and further out from the urban core of Los Angeles. And urban core of Los Angeles is kind of a misnomer, right? It's a multi-nucleated metropolis, but who are living further and further away from their jobs to pull them in. And these freeways were very much embraced in Southern California and Los Angeles, but not so much in the Bay Area. There were attempts to try to create a network, a sort of greater and more powerful network of freeways in the Bay Area, some of which were successful, and in some cases, like in San Francisco, it didn't work out as planned. I want to show you this map. This is actually one of the most interesting images I think I'll show you all semester. This is a map of a plan of a freeway network for San Francisco. These gray lines that you see here, these are actually planned freeways, some of which will get built. Now, what's interesting is, if you look over here by Lake Merced, near where San Francisco State is, you can see there's some of this freeway network is present, and there are actually vestigial pieces of this. So this map was produced in 1947. The construction actually began, and some of the pieces of these freeways were built. 480, a double-decker freeway that ran where the Embarcadero is today, was built, for example, and the pieces connecting 101 and 280 were built as well. And in fact, as you're heading south from campus on 19th Avenue, as it begins to turn into 280, you can see the off-ramps, right? Those were built actually for the anticipated construction of these freeways that would have carved up the city and completely transformed neighborhoods in San Francisco, even crossing through and surrounding Golden Gate Park. It would have destroyed the Panhandle. It just wouldn't exist anymore. It would just be freeway. This is kind of fascinating. People in San Francisco were not thrilled by it, though. Even though some of this will be constructed, most of it will not be, as a result of a political movement in the city in the 1950s known as the Great Freeway Revolt. This is something that will continue on during the 1960s. It means that the Central Freeway will never be created and will never be completed. For example, it just ends up as a stub that we end up demolishing much of in a much later period in the 1990s and the first decade of the 21st century. This is a very different approach to transit. Indeed, the protests around the creation of these freeways in San Francisco will be one of the things that will light a fire in recreating a mass transit system in the Bay Area, which we will later know as BART, Bay Area Rapid Transit. Education was also really profoundly impacted in California as a result of this new population growth. During the 1950s and 1960s, we see the widespread construction of thousands of elementary schools, high schools, and even colleges and universities, particularly community colleges, but also CSU and UC campuses. Most of the CSU and UC system would be built in the in the Cold War period, the post-World War II period. By the beginning of World War II, there were only 3 UCs. By the end of the Cold War, there'll be 9. So think about this. The number of UCs triples, and think about the number of CSUs, which will grow into the 20s by the end of the Cold War. We haven't really built a lot of these universities since, even though the population has continued to grow. It gives you some sensibility, some idea of the sort of pressures on higher education. We'll actually come back to that a little bit when we talk about the master plan for higher ed in our next module. There's also a lot of pressure on recreation and leisure culture, and we start to see a lot of public land starting to open up and take advantage of the weather and the climate in California and the needs of these populations to turn into tourist destinations in their own right. And it's not just people living in California that are coming to the Golden State for leisure and fun time. It's also people from far away. It's during the 1950s that we see the creation of Disneyland, for example, which opens in 1955, built on former citrus groves in Orange County in the city of Anaheim. So this is kind of interesting. We start to see California growing in its sort of identity associated with leisure culture for people outside the state, but also, of course, for people inside the state as well. The Red Scare was alive and well in California as well in terms of California's state and connection to federal politics. California will elect as one of its senators, a man named Richard Nixon, who's from Southern California, from just outside of Whittier, California. Nixon is, of course, a pretty important political figure, and we'll talk about him a little bit in the coming weeks as well. Nixon goes on to become vice president of the United States in 1953, chosen by Dwight D. Eisenhower as his running mate. I have a great picture, actually, of Nixon. Nixon was instrumental in the anti-communist cause. Here he is looking at records from the House Un-American Activities Committee. He served in the House immediately following World War II and then went into the Senate in 1948. This is kind of interesting. He's an interesting political figure, a virulent anti-communist. He makes his name not just going after communists in the federal government, but also supporting attacks on supposed communists in Hollywood. Again, there weren't actually really a whole lot of these communists, right, to find, but the fear around them, people being afraid, motivated them to support these causes. And in Hollywood, a lot of this anti-communist rhetoric was fueled by the activity of the Screen Actors Guild, the #1 union amongst Hollywood actors and performers, right? During the 1950s, the Screen Actors Guild was led by Hollywood actor Ronald Reagan, a New Deal Democrat who changed his party registration in the midst of the sort of Cold War scare in the 1950s and helped to create a blacklist of Hollywood celebrities who he believed and who they believed were supportive of leftist causes. This blacklist didn't just affect performers or directors, it affected people who did sets and costumes, really destroying the careers of thousands of people in the end. Well, hundreds of people at least, I should say. It's not just in Hollywood, though. Even in higher education in the Golden State, the fear about the infiltration of communists was real and present. There was a lot of concern about how people were going to teach young people if they were somehow embroiled in this kind of rhetoric or were not loyal to the United States. In 1949, the University of California system, under sort of following along with this trend of anti-communist rhetoric, will adopt a loyalty oath. Okay, it was trying to really ward off investigation from the federal government and the state government, and it really was divisive. It required all employees of the UC system to declare loyalty to the state constitution and deny membership in subversive organizations. There will be a really kind of controversial series of campaigns about the loyalty oath in the early 1950s. Ultimately, the loyalty oath will continue, although it will ultimately be reworked because there's a legal case that will challenge the efficacy of saying that you aren't members of certain organizations. You can't legally do that. But even to this day, if you're an employee of the University of California, you do have to sign a loyalty oath to the state and federal constitution. It's kind of interesting. Not in the CSU system, though. You don't ever have to do that there. So I want to close by talking a little bit about what I think is actually some of the most interesting part um, of this period, the development in American national culture of something known as the California lifestyle. I mean, think about up until this point, everything we've covered, we start to understand California's deep influence in the sort of culture of the United States, and very broadly, the idea that American culture was being shaped by California experiences through things like Hollywood. But it's in the 1940s and 1950s, at the beginning of the Cold War era, that California becomes synonymous with a way of life that many Americans tried to ape and emulate. Okay, and this idea was really kind of broadly construed as what we call the California lifestyle: living outdoors, engaging in lots of leisure culture, going to the beach, the fantasy of what California is. For those of you who have spent some time away from California, perhaps you grew up in other places or from other places, you know the images we associate with the California lifestyle, because even today, these ideas are pervasive in the United States and across the world. We have expectations of what it means to be Californian. I want to show you a clip. This is actually kind of a long form advertisement for a department store chain that helps to illustrate what this California lifestyle looked like and felt like to a lot of Americans. So go ahead and take just a moment to watch this.
This is the time of year when all of us, all over the country, make big plans for vacations, for weekend trips, and for fun and recreation. Out here in California, where we live out of doors so much of the time, our designers have developed new fashions for casual living. These fashions, styled in California, are gay and colorful, just right for summertime everywhere, and for you too. Summertime is playtime for families, boys and girls, mothers and dads. Here's a typical family breaking loose from the city for a day of fun in the sun. Whoops. Here you go.
Thank you. Look, Judy, that's Janice Page.
Welcome to our part of the country. This is a typical California day. At least it's the kind we like to think is typical. And we're noted for casual outdoor living. But did you know that California has become the fastest growing fashion and design center in the world? That's right. And why not? Look around you. Take that lively family over there who just arrived. Notice their interesting sportswear. To start her day of styled in California fashion, Mother has chosen this beautiful mint green shirtwaist dress of combed cotton. The tailored shirt collar has flexible stays that keep the collar straight and crisp. This dress has comfortable roll-up sleeves and an unpressed pleated skirt featuring a generous 6-inch hem. And could you guess the price? Only $8.98. We'll look at the men's outfits in a minute after we visit with some pretty friends at the barbecue. Checks are a fashion first this summer for almost any activity. The blouse and skirt separates are in fashionable gingham check. And here's real fashion news, a feminine treatment of the jacket blouse in nylon lace and rose applique trim. This very same feature is carried out again in this unpressed pleated full skirt, comfortable and charming. The price? $5.98 for the skirt and $3.98 for the blouse. Mother and her friends might be discussing
Okay, I think hopefully you're getting some of this, right? And especially when you saw the opening of this film, it's like the fantasy of California. It's like sunny all the time. People are surfing. I mean, like, how spot on can you be, right? But this fantasy is really important. People came to California and thought of California as this kind of like perfect Edenic place. And this kind of connects back to some of the things that we've been talking about in this course, right? The fantasy of California as an Eden, as a perfect, beautiful, sunny, wonderful place, right? Of course, here's another postcard. This is from the Salton Sea. Remember that accident that was created in Southern California as a result of trying to bring water in across Arizona, across the state line, I should say, through the Colorado River, right? Salton Sea was actually a tourist destination in the 50s and 60s until it started drying out. I would not recommend a visit today. I actually went 2 years ago to check it out because I'd never been, and it's interesting. It's not like this anymore. But it's kind of interesting, right? This idea California is becoming synonymous with leisure culture, with a cultural ideal of living in a different way. It's not just like going to the beach. It's not just dressing in certain ways. It's even the kinds of homes Californians lived in. During the 40s and 50s, the ranch-style home that is developed and popularized in California will spread across the United States. Even schools that are being built across the United States will be built in a California style with open-air breezeways. Now, think about this. If you're growing up in Duluth, Minnesota, you're not going to want to go to a high school that has open-air breezeways where for 4 months out of the year, it's polar ice cold, right? Think about it. These kinds of styles of architecture, of dress, of design are evocative of a California sensibility that is becoming synonymous with being American. We see this sort of transitional period of California becoming so emblematic with the American experience during the 40s and 50s, reflected in popular music and popular culture of this era as well. The jazz culture of California in the 1930s and 40s, centered in San Francisco and Los Angeles and districts like the Fillmore District in San Francisco, will give way to a new music culture which is really strong and evocative of the California experience, rock and roll. Although rock and roll is going to emerge in a variety of different American cities like Detroit, Cleveland, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and Los Angeles have vibrant rock and roll scenes, especially as rock and roll moves between the 40s and 50s away from being a black art form to being an art form where white bands are becoming more popular and more present. In essence, becoming a more mainstream art form because of the racial identities of the bands, like groups like Bill Haley and his Comets, for example. The recording industry will start to grow in California as a result of popular music becoming a more sort of consumable good. More and more Americans, particularly young Americans, are going to be buying record albums. The film industry also is going to go through an interesting transformation. In the second half of the 1940s, the film industry is going to produce a series of really complicated texts, really interesting films that ape a French style from the 30s and early 40s called film noir. American film noir, which really reaches its peak with films like Double Indemnity, The Blue Dahlia, and my favorite, the 1950 film Sunset Boulevard, will critique California. Instead of illustrating California as this Edenic place in the California lifestyle, film noir like Sunset Boulevard show California as a gritty, unpleasant, and potentially even inherently evil place, both in the cities like Los Angeles as well as cities like San Francisco. Of all these areas, though, it's television that is going to be the most important. Television production starting really in the late 40s and early 50s as televisions start to become a popular consumer good. By the end of the 50s, there is one television for every 5 Americans, so televisions are becoming more ubiquitous in American homes. We start to see television production centered in Hollywood and its surrounding areas become more common in the Southern California landscape, and certainly project the California experience directly into people's homes. Shows like I Love Lucy, which is a more East Coast show, will be challenged by West Coast shows like Ozzie and Harriet. Think of Ozzie and Harriet, it's a family sitcom which is scripted, but these were a real family. This is actually real people who were a married couple and it's their actual children. It's kind of like a sort of anticipating what we'll have with the Kardashians. Well, not really at all, but indeed, actually, the celebrity that comes with Ozzie and Harriet is pretty fascinating, especially for their son Ricky, who becomes what we call a heartthrob during the late 1950s. The idea of the situation comedy, in particular, being centered around California family experiences is not surprising. Even the shows that don't depict California as an explicit setting or character are all filmed here, which makes a huge difference in terms of the styles that families will ape in terms of fashion, in terms of houses, etc. Okay? It is this suburban culture that we see developing in California around the ranch-style home, around these sort of single-family detached dwellings in these sort of decentralized suburban communities, and other parts of the United States will attempt to mimic and ape. And we really see this. If you do ever have a chance and spend time in other American cities, we see the post-war suburbs of cities, even like Chicago, which have a much deeper history, starting to look a whole lot more like Southern California. So California is entering into a really interesting period. And next week, we're going to be talking about what I will have to say is, of all the time periods that I could choose to live in, it would be this period. It's California during the 1960s and early 1970s. I'm really looking forward to seeing your reflections. Be sure to reach out to me if you have any questions or concerns, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.